The 1964 Civil Rights Bill was the most significant piece of legislation in 20th century U.S. history. Systematic racial prejudice was the greatest stain on America's reputation, and the '64 bill did much to remove it. With its passing, the federal government upheld substantial laws against racial discrimination and paved the way for a full redress of a damaging problem. After the American Civil War and the first Reconstruction, the ex-Confederate states relapsed into segregation. A network of racist fiats termed Jim Crow laws saw that public facilities, washrooms, water fountains, hotels were segregated. The justice system overwhelmingly favored whites, and jobs were limited to the menial. In the South, segregation founded on the separate but equal doctrine established in Plessy v. Ferguson 1898 meant that blacks were confined to second-class status. This was mirrored by de facto segregation in the North. Although not legally inferior, Northern blacks were not able to access good-quality housing or jobs. In response, CR advocacy groups were formed throughout the early 20th century. The Big Four were the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, formed in 1909, the Congress of Racial Equality, formed in 1942, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, formed in 1957, and the Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee, formed in 1960. Each lobbied the government, and together they coordinated protests. The federal government did little in response. Southern politicians vetoed any attempts to pass legislation. Blacks didn't have the ability to wield their vote in protest, and the ex-Confederate South was uniformly opposed to racial advancement. President Roosevelt had maintained popularity among low-income blacks with his New Deal policies, and President Truman desegregated the Army in 1948, but little was done to improve the lot of the average black citizen. A few racial incidents, such as the murder of Emmett Till, the aborted registration of Autherine Lucy at Alabama University, and the Montgomery bus boycott, had given the issue some exposure in the North, but ignorance and inertia of modern whites continued to be an issue. In 1954, the separate but equal doctrine was rejected by the Supreme Court in Brown v. Board of Education. Its unanimous ruling that segregated public schools were inherently unequal mandated the federal government to desegregate schools, paving the way for a series of crises that would expose Southern prejudice. The first came in 1957, when President Truman sought to integrate Little Rock High School in Arkansas. He deployed federal troops when Governor Orville Faubus opposed the ruling, and ultimately saw that the school was integrated. The trend continued under the Kennedy administration. Throughout the early 1960s, a number of racial crises put pressure on the administration to do something significant. In the Freedom Rides of April 1961, two groups of activists tested the Supreme Court ruling that all interstate travel facilities must be desegregated by riding buses throughout several southern states. They were met in Anniston, Birmingham, and Montgomery by groups of white supremacists. Their buses were burned, and the activists were savagely beaten. There was clear collaboration between the police and the KKK, and the Kennedy administration's actions were limited to damage control. In early 1961, James Meredith, a black World War II veteran, had his application to study at the University of Mississippi rejected purely on racial grounds. The Kennedy administration intervened on Meredith's behalf, but Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett calculated that it was politically impossible for him to accept the ruling. Tensions culminated in a standoff between U.S. Marshals and a racist mob outside the university on September 30th. Nearly 100 marshals were injured, but the administration was credited with calmly fulfilling its promise. JFK had always refused to denounce racist actions in moral terms, taking the position that he was merely following the letter of the law. However, protests in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963 proved seminal. Project C was a protest designed to provoke a violent reaction from the city's thuggish police commissioner, Eugene Bull Connor. Connor craved publicity and was prepared to use significant force in suppressing the protests. A march on the city hall saw police clash with protesters, many of whom were children. The use of dogs and fire hoses produced horrific scenes that created an international outcry and spawned a sequence of national protests. Introducing legislation was now a viable political proposition. Before Birmingham, the lack of national awareness and feeling for the issue had meant the Southern caucus could dominate discussions of race. But now, JFK had a popular mandate to pursue legislation. This he did, giving a national address that called for legislation because it is right. His unprecedented moral tone committed the federal government to realizing substantive legislation. The legislation itself was remarkably broad. Emulating the 1875 Civil Rights Act, it included a public accommodations title, Title II, that outlawed discrimination in access to public facilities, as well as reaffirming and protecting the universal right to vote. It also strengthened both the Attorney General's authority to intervene in school desegregation cases and provisions against discrimination in federally funded institutions. JFK was assassinated before the bill could make substantial progress. It had passed the Judiciary Committee, but languished in the Senate Finance Committee, headed by arch-segregationist Harry Byrd. The assassination was initially considered a hammer blow for the cause. Vice President Lyndon Johnson, who was a member of the Southern caucus, had a poor voting record on civil rights and seemingly didn't have the political security to pursue such a risky initiative. However, Johnson was emotionally committed to advancing civil rights. In his first address to Congress as president, Johnson said, "No memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long." Johnson recognized that JFK's substantial income tax cut was hampering the Civil Rights Bill's progress. Johnson dislodged the tax bill by promising Harry Byrd that he would bring the national budget in below $100 billion. In doing so, he cleared the way for the Civil Rights Act, which passed the Rules Committee and House of Representatives with relative ease. The Senate was a different story. A Southern bloc of 18 Southern Democrats and one Republican, led by Richard Russell, was resolved to destroy the bill. Using Vice President Hubert Humphrey as a proxy, Johnson cajoled congressmen and senators into backing the bill. He crucially got Everett Dirksen and his votes on side, and in doing so won enough votes to pass a cloture vote. Dirksen was not emotionally committed to civil rights reform, but he was compelled to accept the political necessities that underpinned it, and his vote saw a new supportive majority formed. The bill passed the Senate 77-23 and was signed into law on July 2, 1964. Although the bill didn't produce significant immediate improvements in the lives of Black Americans, it gave the federal government the tools to expunge systemic prejudice. And, along with the 1965 Voting Rights Bill, which reinforced some of the '64 bill's provisions, saw that the federal government was broadly supportive of equality and justice.